For many older adults, cooking isn't just about preparing meals, it's about joy, tradition, independence. But it's often one of the first concerns families raise when deciding whether a loved one can remain safely at home. The risks are real. According to ready.gov, even a small kitchen fire can engulf an entire house in just 3 to 5 minutes. Now imagine how frightening that is for somebody with a mobility challenge who might need just that much time to get to the door. Resources like the National Fire Protection Association's Step to Safety program are helping educate communities about fire and fall prevention. But what's really exciting is how technology is stepping in as a safety net. Smart stoves that can shut off automatically, sensors that can send alerts to caregivers, even systems that detect when nobody's moving in the kitchen and cut the power. In today's conversation, we'll explore how innovations like these make it possible for older adults to keep cooking and stay safe while doing it. To help me kick off this important topic of kitchen safety, I'm thrilled to be joined by Akshita Iyer from Om Kitchen. But first, a disclosure. Before we begin, we'd like to note that today's guest, Akshita Iyer, is the founder of Om Kitchen. While this episode will explore a range of technology solutions related to cooking safety, we want to be transparent that one or more of the solutions discussed is associated with the guest company. Our goal is to provide balanced educational content, and other product types and considerations will also be discussed. And now, back to our conversation. Welcome to Innovative Aging, a podcast for clinicians who want to stay creative, stay informed, and stay connected to what's possible. I'm your host, Carol Chiang, an occupational therapist with 27 years of experience in rehab and home-based care. I know how hard clinicians work to keep their clients aging safely, whether that means hacking together solutions, testing new products, or thinking 3 steps ahead. If you're passionate about helping your clients function better, but just don't have the time to keep up with all the latest solutions, this podcast is for you. On Innovative Aging, you'll hear practical, energizing conversations with experts in rehab, design, and innovation that can spark fresh ideas you can bring back to the people you serve. Together, we can rethink what it means to age well at home and lead the way in shaping the future of aging. Let's dive in. Welcome, Akshita. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and how you normally interact with clinicians?
Thank you so much for having me, Carol. Hi, everyone. My name is Akshita. I am the founder and CEO of Om, and we are a startup focused on making kitchens safer, especially for older adults, so that they can continue to live independently and safely right in the comfort of their own home. I typically work closely with clinicians and clinical care teams, occupational therapists, and senior living communities to really better understand the real world challenges that their residents face in their own home. These collaborations help me translate clinical insights into practical technology solutions, whether it's modifying their existing environment, implementing safety protocols, or even introducing devices that can serve as compensatory tools for everyday tasks like cooking.
I love that. I mean, really, the discussion around cooking is so difficult. I mean, in most times, older adults are shocked that they left the stove on. And, I think it's because it's a paradox against like what they feel inside. They feel like they're 25 and they're like, how could a 25-year-old me leave this on? And I would say also the adult children are the ones who are really surprised from it. And they react by saying, all right, from now on, you're only cooking if somebody's in the house with you to supervise, so that you need this extra person, this extra layer of safety. And for me, that's super tricky because it plays into this belief that as you get older, you start losing your independence. First is the car keys, then it's the cooking. Next is like, I can't take a shower on my own. So, this is why I love that technology is going to be a solution to help older adults continue doing those things that they love to do and things that are intricately tied to their self identity. So, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your origin story and like why you think these conversations are so important to be having right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everything you said really takes me back to why I started the company. So I actually thought I was going to go to med school, and I took a couple of gap years. And in that time, my mom, who was diagnosed with Parkinson's right when I graduated, accidentally left the stove on and started a kitchen fire. And I had never really talked to my parents about aging and what that meant, and what it meant for them living at home until this happened. And quite honestly, we hadn't even talked really about what this disease meant for her as just an individual, but then also as you're getting older. And one of the first things, Carol, that she told me was, I'm scared of what I'm going to lose in terms of independence. Like she was super active, is, even till this day, super active, but life really did change. And so, it really just was a big reality check for me of, my parents are not planning on leaving their house anytime soon. I know they love to cook. And on top of losing independence, she was just really scared of cooking, right? Like, what if this happens again? I just don't even want to do it. But then I'm like, who's cooking at home? And so it really just brought to light that we have, a lot of technology at our fingertips these days, but are we really using it to solve pain points, especially as we get older, which every single one of us, is going to do. And so I really wanted to figure out how, one, to make my mom safer and to make me feel some peace of mind that she could cook and be safe. But then also this broader question of what are we doing to help people age in place safely and comfortably with technology that doesn't feel brand new and unrecognizable.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, I'm a Parkinson's specialist and I feel like I hear that all the time. People leave the neurologist's office and they're in shock because
Mhm.
all it sounds like is these are all the things you cannot do from now on. And basically it's going to go downhill from here. And the
Yeah.
wonderful thing, honestly, about Parkinson's, and I'm going to reference Dr. Michael Oken's new book, The Parkinson's Plan. I mean, he talks about how there's a lot more out there that you can do for Parkinson's. I mean, before it was your choice was medications, that's it. And
Mhm.
now there is lots and lots of evidence and anecdotal evidence that I've seen where people do so much better with exercise. Exercise
Mhm.
slows the progression of Parkinson's. Taking Cinemet is like taking a Tylenol. It just treats the symptoms, but it doesn't stop the progression. But you can
Right.
actually stop the progression with exercise. So we'll have to talk about that another time for sure. But I mean, all of that so resonates with me because it is this idea of losing things. And I can really remember a consult that I had where they had one of those perfect situations. The son lived in the condo, maybe 2 floors down from the mom. She got her independence. He got to feel like, okay, I can just run up and
Mhm.
see her anytime if she needs anything, if I want to bring her dinner or whatever. But, it was one of these times where at Thanksgiving and she decided, hey, I'm going to make like the thing that I love to make that's my son's favorite. And I'm going to do it for him. And she forgot. She came in and her show was on and, you know, she's watching TV and suddenly the thing that clued her in that there was a fire was the smoke alarm going. And because she wasn't super mobile, by the time she got there were real flames in there. So I mean, everybody was freaked out. And the son was calling me saying, listen, like, we need to figure this out. Like, I don't want to take her independence away, but I don't want to be responsible for her passing away from such a tragic way. So, like, what are the options? And sadly, at that time, I mean, I had to use my OT brain in here. I'm talking about compensatory techniques, like write yourself a note, and like tie the string around your finger, like those kinds of things. I mean, they're great, but listen, those take discipline, they take time, and that doesn't help
Yeah.
the son feel better. I mean, he's two
Mhm.
floors up, thinking, oh my goodness, is this going to be the time? So and calling somebody to say, hey, I'm turning on the stove, hey, I'm turning off the stove, this just doesn't feel good. So I love that technology like is coming in to figure some of these things out. But I just first want to hear a little bit more about like what kind of challenges you've heard around the topics of cooking.
Yeah, so outside of, just leaving the stove on, by accident, we've heard of, older adults with dementia and Alzheimer's, even getting up in the middle of the night, right? And thinking it's time to cook and they leave it on. And so, I think just generally the topic of how do you make sure that the stove is off when it needs to be off. But then beyond that, we've also heard a lot of, especially for stoves that have knobs that face away, like on ranges, that older adults and just more broadly, and there's been a lot of talk around this problem in the appliance world, but accidentally bumping the knobs and turning it into the ignite, or for an electric, turning it to on, right? And you don't realize you put a pizza box on, and then and then you have a kitchen fire, or you have gas spewing, and so that's another issue we've heard quite a bit. And then we've also heard that, when if there is all of a sudden the smoke alarm goes off, or, all of a sudden the older adult realize that the stove is on and they try to get up too fast and try to rush to the stove, that there's a fall risk, right? So like everything around just one, safer cooking, but then, all of the actions that happen before and after, is just they're all really big safety risks. And, unfortunately, as you mentioned, we're starting to see products that can detect all of these things, ambient sensors, right? You mentioned sensors earlier, which is a great way to, under the radar. So nobody, it's not obtrusive, where we can actually detect for these anomalies and then alert the right person. But those are some of the things that we've heard from the communities and clinicians we've been talking to.
Yeah, and that's super important. Honestly, rushing is the number one reason, in my opinion, for falls. I mean,
Uh-huh.
whether that is rushing to the bathroom to not have an
Mhm.
accident, rushing to get to the door because you're worried about, I don't know, like the UPS guy leaving before you have a chance to sign for the package. I mean, really, it's those odd times that we have to worry
Yep.
about and not like the regular day to days. And the question is, like, how do we make sure that those kinds of things are taken care of? I will say, after my experience, I really started looking like crazy for solutions. And, at that time, I think that the first solution I found was called Simply Home. And that was mostly in the disability space. I mean, he really wasn't doing anything in aging. And I found what his product was doing was so fascinating because, it not only did things like locks and your regular smart home things, but it's monitoring the outlets. And so and with motion sensing combined, that's serious information that instead
Yeah.
of just one or the other. And I loved the fact that it was very tailorable, the way that OTs like to kind of grade it and say, okay, well, if the stove is on, if we detect that the stove is on and there hasn't been motion in there in 10 minutes, then you get a text message. And it's
Mhm.
like, hey, like a little nudge. Did you forget something on the stove? Oh my gosh, I forgot something on the stove. Okay,
Mhm.
great. But it's
Yeah.
awesome because it gives you like a paper trail of sorts. And next time you can do better. And then it also creates the safety aspect of it
Mhm.
so that if you don't respond to that and maybe your ringer's off and you don't notice it, well, it
Mhm.
goes to your next person. Maybe that next contact is still not 911. Maybe it's your neighbor, maybe it's a care team member, but you can set all these things to go to the next one, filters down and filters down. And
Yeah.
so I mean, I love that nowadays I'm seeing a lot of technologies giving these customizable choices.
Mhm.
And it's really important because that's what helps empower people to be able
Yeah.
to say like, okay, this is the amount of help I need. Don't give me more than that. Let me
Yep.
try to live in the least restricted environment possible. That is so
Yeah.
OT.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear about you and how you have set this up because I know I've heard similar things with your stuff.
Well, one thing, Kara, I wanted to mention, and you alluded to this about different data points you're getting from different pieces of technology. I think it's really important that it's not like you just need something for stove safety and you don't need motion sensors, right? I think what we want to get to is a point where there are multiple ambient sensors in the home, and that you
Mhm.
can correlate the two, right? Like you said, if we know the stove is on and we know that there has been no movement for 2 hours or an hour, whatever, like you said, when we tailor it so that we know, hey, you should be moving around every hour, right? Or something should have happened within that time, then those 2 data points together then tell someone something's wrong. But it's not just the stove is on, and it's not just there hasn't been no motion. So I think that, you know,
Yeah.
the interconnection between all of these sensors that we're talking about and technologies more broadly is really, really important when it comes to clinical use cases, right? Because, I mean, you know better than anyone that you can't just look at, one aspect of someone's life. You have to look at it much more holistically. That's exactly how we have to look at technology.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree, and, to your point about turning the stove on and off, I mean, you've never worn scrubs, but scrubs have these big giant pockets on them,
Yeah.
and you would not believe how many of my scrubs, like, have ripped pockets because they catch on doorknobs, they catch on, like, the
Yeah.
stove, I mean, all kinds of things, and, it kinda brings me to the idea that, understanding how to pick those solutions and looking at what the options are now that the technology is really a lot more prevalent in the kitchen safety arena, like what are those other ways to do it? So, for I'm just going to throw out an example here, like that idea of, make big pockets, that's what kind of happens when you're deaf. So if you're deaf, you don't have that feedback of rip and
Yeah.
oh shoot, I turned it on,
Yeah.
so understanding like those making those connections I think is really important. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about like what other options are there out there that people could consider.
Yeah, I mean, for fire safety, or rather stove safety, it's not a new problem. We've been dealing with this as almost an inevitability, right? Like that we cook all the time. The stove is the number one appliance used. But they're gonna be house fires, and, we're gonna have $1 billion in property damage every year, and they're gonna be, deaths, and it's just the way the world has worked, and I think it really surprised me that, we just treated it as an inevitability. Having said that, well before Ohm came around, there have been, people trying to solve for this. So we have, thermal sensors that can detect if there's too much heat, and then it'll sound an alarm, and then you would go and turn the stove off and it would alert you. There are also like surge protector like devices that'll plug into where your stove plugs in, and then it'll listen for the sound of the smoke alarm, and then it'll turn the stove off. There's also fire suppression systems, so if it does detect high levels of heat, it'll just automatically spray just to make sure that if there is a fire that it's put out. And then of course you have your smoke detectors, right? And that's what it's there for. The way we approached it though was a more of a preventative versus a reactive solution, right? Once your smoke detector goes off, probably have a big fire. Like you said earlier, fires can overtake an entire home in 3 to 5 minutes. And so we
Yeah.
wanted to try to figure out, well, can we take one step even further back? Right. And we can have all of these, downstream safeguards. But what if we could catch it before it even got to a point where you have smoke damage and potentially fire, and your smoke alarm goes off? And that's where, our technology really came in. But we're not the first ones to try to solve for it, and we certainly, will not be the last. There are a lot of ways to tackle this problem. The way we took was, the route of your, smart retrofit devices, right? Can we just retrofit to something you use every day?
Yeah, I love that, I love that. And, I was gonna say what the one thing that I find really interesting with the solutions out there are the ones that can take action. So, for
Yeah,
me, it's not enough for me to know that the fire alarm is going off or that something
exactly.
is burning. I mean, I need to do something about it,
Yeah,
right? And I often actually tell this story about how when my kids were little, I mean, everybody I'm sure can relate to this kind of thing, but, you're in a rush, like you've got this to drop off and that to do, and you're running out of the house and I'm pulling out of the driveway thinking, oh shoot, is the
yeah,
stove still on, and so rather than me driving back to go over there, I can pull over, look at the app, is it on, yes or no, and actually turn it off from my phone. So
yeah,
to me that is a huge lifesaver, and it's just to the point that kitchen safety, fire safety, this is not for older adults. This is for everybody. This is
yeah.
general fire safety for every age group, especially the busy moms out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you mentioned a good point of that connectivity, right? So, a lot of the solutions that existed, just it had an alarm, or it wasn't connected to your Wi-Fi or to your phone, so that you could take action. And I think what we found there, where we found there is a huge opportunity in just connectivity of technology, and then of our solution, even of others, is that you can build that feedback loop, right? That alert system. So even if you're not home, you get that alert. And if the product doesn't take action, like you can take action from wherever you are. And then also that connectivity comes with data, right? So every
Mhm.
time, there's an incident, what time of day, and how many times it's happened, and there's a lot of information you can gather about someone's well-being, and just, general safety precautions and parameters that you should, have in place. And so I think, the connectivity piece is really important, but also what are you doing with the data that you get? And are you actually providing it back to your end customer in a way that's digestible and actionable?
Yeah, that is so true, and I'll tell you, for a lot of years, I did, age in place or find a new space, so the idea being like, "Look, are we actually safe at home? And if not, do we need to go to another location?" And one of the primary, I guess, teachings I would do in there was, like, take the emotion out of it, like, don't be subjective. You can't approach somebody and say, "Dad, like, I don't think you're safe to live here anymore by
Yeah.
yourself. You need to
Yeah.
move." People don't react to that. But
Yeah.
people do react to objective data, and
Yep.
that's like I think that that's the thing that I have appreciated the most about kitchen safety technology is that it provides that kind of data to have that conversation in a very objective, maybe chilled out way. I'm not
Yep.
sure, but at least just saying, "Look, I'm really worried about you.
Yeah.
You've left the stove on 3 times this week. Is there something I can do to help with that? Maybe we need to set reminders, develop a routine where you have, like when you have the stove on, you turn on this alarm and you do this and these kind of cues to let you know, okay, like that's still on. I mean, honestly, even for me, my cue is I turn on the exhaust. If the exhaust is
Yep.
running, I know that the stove is on, and I
Yep.
only allow myself to turn the exhaust
Yep.
off when my stove is off. And still
Yep.
sometimes, you know what? Like, I have been caught with times where I'll look and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, like I had it on tiny little low and I
Yep.
forgot, like I
And you
might
don't
have
realize.
served the last thing. I didn't realize.
Yeah.
Holy crap, that could have been
Yeah.
really bad." So, I mean, it's a big deal, but checking, like, the whole picture is so
Mhm.
vital. Like, it gives us so many more tools as OTs. It's not just about an on and off switch. It's about
Yeah.
having a bigger conversation around it.
Yeah, and it reminds me of one of the several conversations we've had with clinical care teams at senior living communities when it's time to have a conversation with family members about their loved one, and that maybe their memory is deteriorating, or and they've left the stove on, like and again, the stove is one data point, but you're absolutely right that people react better and less emotionally and more rationally when you give them data. And so part of what we
Yeah.
did was provide, baseline level data. And then, if we saw anomalies like, hey, your loved one left the stove on 3 times this week, if you take that data with you to that conversation and say, look, this is what we're seeing activity looks like, it's a much easier conversation than think that mom is not doing so well, and we think that this and this and this is happening, but with that data, I think you can really provide, I guess, have confidence, right? And going in with a plan of, okay, this is what we're seeing, and this is what we can do to mitigate it, right? If you don't know exactly what's happening, you don't have that data, you're just making assumptions, and then maybe even moving someone into assisted living or nursing without the need, and perhaps technology could solve for it. We've had that happen too.
That is so true. It's so true. It reminds me of like all the conversations I have with people with when they have symptoms, and I'm like, look, you have to track it. What you
Mhm.
don't track, you don't
Yep,
remember. And
yep.
we are all terrible historians because if you ask me what I had for lunch yesterday, I have no idea. So,
Yes.
if you want to track habits, that's the only way to be able to see what is actually going to happen later. And to me, like that's the whole thing about being not all or nothing. It's not you're not safe. We're going to take away the stove. There is an in between there, and to recognize, okay, how much risk is it? And then how much risk are we willing to take
Yep.
on? So whether that is aging in place or skilled nursing, I love that you talked about that, or I'm sorry, independent living. In
Mhm.
independent living, I know I've had patients where they've said, well, like they're not really comfortable with me having a full size stove. I could do a microwave or I could do like a little hot plate, but I like to bake cookies. And,
Yeah.
that's a problem, and I want to be able to do these things. And I think that, being able to have those data points and saying, "Look, like, I understand that as a community, you're trying to decrease risk, and it's everybody who's living in the community that you're worried about, but how about, like, we check? Like, let's gather data points for a month,
Mhm.
and like just see. And I think that you're absolutely right. It builds confidence in somebody's ability for that person. It builds
Mhm.
confidence in the people who are worried about them or worried about their property. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's fantastic. And I just want to kind of move into the idea that, no solution's perfect for everybody.
Mhm.
So, clinicians have to be able to understand, like, when are these solutions good and when are these solutions something that maybe aren't ideal. And I know that you've mentioned to me before that, this all came about before because of your mom. So
Yeah.
I'd like to hear, what happened when you went to go searching for solutions? Like this happened
Yeah.
with your mom and you as a caregiver said, "Holy crap, I need to go do something." What did you do and what did you find?
Yeah, and, I mean, goes back to this is not a new problem, and I think that was the moment I realized how many people were struggling with this, and so, yeah, I went where you typically go to look for products, right, like Amazon or, I did a Google search, and I did find these other products that we discussed earlier, but, some of them required you to remove the stove and then install it, and I live 1,000 miles away from my parents, so I was like, "I don't know who's gonna do that." Like, I don't know if my dad's gonna do that, but I wanna make sure that it's installed correctly. And then, there were the alarms, but like you said with the alarms, I'm like, "Well, what if my parents are not there?" Right? And what if they can't
Yeah.
get to the stove quickly, right? Like, what if my mom is having, side effects in that moment? And so none of the solutions out there worked for my mom. But what I knew she knew how to do was cook, right? Like she uses the stove every day. Like she's been using it for the last 50 or I guess she wasn't cooking that young, but she's been using it for the last like 40 years. Um and so I thought, what if I could create something that leveraged the knob, right? So the place where she goes to cook every day. Now, like you said, there's not every solution works for everyone. And what we found with the smart knob is, if you have a multi-person household, right? So if you have a lot of people in the house, let's say it's grandma, grandpa, and you know grandkids. Like if a lot of people are cooking, we found that it could be obtrusive to have that shut off, right? Because someone might be using it, and then just someone
Oh,
else might be using it right after, and so that became obtrusive. And so we found that that wasn't a great fit for them. For some stoves, we did have compatibility issues, right? Where the knob didn't quite sit the way that the old knobs did. And so, we had people who didn't want to use it then. What else did we run into? Color, form factor. We had like I mean, people like the way their kitchens look, right?
right.
Especially older adults. Actually, that's one of probably the biggest pieces of feedback, especially with the first generation, was I really like my kitchen aesthetic, and I really like the way my knobs look. And so, if I'm going to change this, is it going to look exactly like the ones that I already have? And unfortunately, we just can't create so many different colors and schemes. But that was another big thing too, right? And you think about technology, nobody wants something sticking out, right? If you like
Yeah.
are constantly drawn to it and you know that it's there, it feels, especially for older adults, like it feels like just obtrusive, and it feels like there's something in your way that shouldn't be there. And so we've had people who said that just color and size and form factor don't work for them. And some people also say that I don't want so many alerts. Right. And I really just want to know when the stove is left on, when it's shut off. I don't want to know, a minute. We have like a minute warning beforehand. And, unfortunately, you also can't cater alerts to every single person. Right. But there are other systems out there that do have less alerts. So those are things that come to mind of our solution. But in coming up with that idea, I did have to look at everything that existed, and really figure out, well, is that going to work for my mom? No. Is this going to work for my mom? No. And maybe bits and pieces of those solutions would have. I just kind of took all that and then created one that I knew would work for her.
I love that. It's exactly, I think, what OTs do all the time with assessment. We're looking at all these solutions, and maybe three or four of them are a pretty decent fit, but you don't like based on that person. You're like, I really need this particular one, and
Yeah.
I just can't get it with this mix of it. So I really do think that is like that art and science of OT just figuring out, well, I don't know, are they more likely to do this versus this? And that actually reminds me a little bit of, when I'm thinking about motion activated lights, because there's always a discussion about battery operated, like plugged
Mhm.
in or hardwire. Because, one is hardwire is expensive, then, the plug in, I don't have maintenance, but now I have a tripping hazard, and
Yeah.
battery, I need to be disciplined enough to change it. So which of these risks do I think are the best one for us to take? So,
And
yeah, I'd love to hear your
that's a
ideas on that.
And that's a great point too of why our technology wouldn't hasn't worked for some people of, how often do you need to charge something, right? And if it's
Right.
and our device, because it's a retrofit, you do have to charge it every, 4 to 5 months. And we've had, and typically, it's the caregivers or, adult children who are installing this, and they're like, well, if I live, 3,000 miles away, I don't live, on the 2 floors beneath, my parents, and so if it needs to be charged, who's gonna do that? And what if they can't, right? What if they don't want to or know how to take the knob top off and plug it in? And so that's been, a big challenge for us because unfortunately we're not hardwired into the stove yet. And so we have had people say, well, we need a solution that, is has minimal battery requirements and either or can be plugged into the wall. And there are solutions out there too, but that's another thing we've struggled with. And you're absolutely right. Tripping hazards, wires, just general setup and install. And, one of the questions we get as well is how easy is this solution for my mom to understand? Like, is she, going to be pulling her hair out because she feels like she can't cook anymore? That was a big
Yeah, is it
consideration too.
intuitive?
Yeah. Is it intuitive? Exactly.
Yeah. Right. And you really bring up a really good point because in life, I think people are always like, I want this, 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 and this, and I want to pay a dollar. And it's really tough because
Yes.
you know, you have to balance. You have to balance like the cost versus the hassle factor and what are you going to do for that? This actually is the conversation I have with grab bars a lot of times. I'm like, look, if you don't want to end up having to pay a lot of money, these expensive grab bars or installation or caregivers or whatever, you need to exercise. Exercise is
Yes.
cheap. It takes a lot of discipline.
Yep.
If you're not that kind of person, you need to expect that you're going to have to kick in the money to
Yep.
pay for something that isn't going to be that. So, and I
So
think for your solution, it's at an affordable price point where you can manage something like that. But can it do everything? No. But
true.
if you really need something like that, you
Yep.
need to expect to pay a little bit more for that. So, I think this has just been such an enlightening conversation. And, we're coming to the end of our time here, and I really want to hear some stories, maybe for people to be able to understand, like, what does this look like in practice? Like, if I were to have this conversation with a client, like, what would it look like?
Yeah. So when we, go to senior living communities, typically how it goes, and I'll share an example, is we talk to the director, and then, we typically meet with the clinical care team, and when we run our initial what we call a pilot, right, just to test it out, just to make sure it works, and we've got an entire software infrastructure that's sending alerts to caregivers and the IT team, and what clinicians typically do is pick a couple of residents they know are at high risk. And so
Okay.
there was a resident who had previous incidences of the smoke alarm going off and the stove being on. And so they already knew that this was a problem that needed to be solved for. And she didn't want to move. And taking her stove away was not an option. And so they said, okay, let's start with her. And the pilot and what we tracked was, of course, making sure that if we detected that the stove was on, we turn it off. But it was much more tailored and nuanced than that, too, right? Because, like you said, not only is every technology different, but every person's different. And so the way our auto shutoff works is it's counting down on a timer. And so, based on this woman's cooking habits, we said after 10 minutes, if the knob is still on, we turn it off. And so that was one way we tailored it. And then the second thing we started to hear, and we briefly referenced it earlier, is, how do you detect the anomalies, right? Not just, is someone doing the things they should be every day, but when is something off? And what we realized through these senior living communities is, we could actually establish a baseline of someone's general cooking activity. And so for this resident, it was every morning at 8:30 she would make eggs or whatever she was making on her stove. I'm guessing it was eggs, but it was the same thing for the same amount of time every single morning. We are creatures of habit, especially as we get older. And so, what we were able to map out first is okay, this is how often she cooks, when she cooks, what time of day she cooks. And then with time, what we were able to do is actually identify not only when the auto shut off engage, which I think happened a couple times per month, but we could actually detect when she didn't cook for a couple of days. And so we had
Mm.
parameters set in place where, nobody wants to be checked on all the time, and nobody wants to do the checking all the time. And so we built this so that we would alert someone when it looks off. And so we did have a couple of times as well where, she hadn't cooked. We had set the parameters, I believe, for 2 days. So if she didn't cook in the morning for 2 days, then we would send an alert, and then they'd go and check on her. And so, we learned a lot in this process, um, about not only, the value of safety, right? Because we're now seeing twice a month, we're turning this resident stove off because it's left on. But then also the implications of the data that we're gathering and those data points, which can be used, like we talked about, in combination with everything else the clinical care team is tracking to make sure that they're catching things preventatively if she is deteriorating at all. Fortunately, in this case, I don't think, at least at the time when I was, very heavily tracking that it was anything concerning. But you never know, right? And these are all
Yeah.
data points that you can then take to, your physicians and just generally holistically look at someone's progression over time.
I think it's really fascinating because it's so easy to look at these solutions as point solutions. Like,
Mhm.
I just want to turn my stove on and off. But actually, the amount of data and impact you can make by pulling that data is actually pretty amazing. I mean, OTs look at cooking as an ADL.
Yep.
Feeding yourself, and these are like movement. This is just giving you all this information about a person's daily activity level and, a conversation piece to start. Like, hey, I just noticed on, that I got an alert that you're not moving around as much. Is everything okay? You're not feeling well. Maybe you're starting to come down with something. Do you need me to help you bring some chicken soup? I don't know. But it
Yep.
gives you something to talk about. And so it doesn't have to be these daily conversations where somebody is calling just to say, "Hey mom, I'm checking in on you." Okay, you're good, you're alive, great, bye. You know, you can
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
call and just have a real conversation and not be about, your
Yeah.
function because you've got passive alerts that or at least data points that are streaming to you that can tell
Yep.
you those things. So you don't have to have that conversation every single time. It's helping people have better conversations and relationships.
That's so true. I remember after the incident with my mom, like, I would just call all the time but I wouldn't you're right, like, I wouldn't be calling to say hi. I'd be like, "Is everything okay?" Like, she's like, "Can you ask me how I am?" Like, can we just talk for the sake of talking?" But I didn't have I didn't have any other feedback, right? So, now I do. So when I call her, I don't have to ask her, right? And so that's such a good point because I think, especially in today's day and age where you probably, a lot of people live away from their family members, right? And you don't want your dynamic to all of a sudden, as your parents get older, to be all about, are you okay? Are you okay? Because then it makes them feel like, wait, am I okay? And it's so funny that, I was talking to one of my cousins the other day and how, as your parents start getting older and you start noticing, just small things, right? Like, even like with my mom's Parkinson's, is like you kind of the dynamic starts changing where you're like just constantly checking up and it's like you're a helicopter parent, but in reverse. And that's not fun for them.
Yeah.
Right. And they don't want that dynamic to change. And so it's a really good point of how that, feedback loop and that stream of data can just help you even build a better relationship, with your family members when you're not somewhere close.
Yeah, I talk about this idea so much that, the role of tools and products in H tech is truly just to preserve those meaningful relationships. Like
Yes.
you need to get out of this caregiver patient dynamic, especially husband and wives have this where
Oh,
it just
so true.
becomes this like personal fight about,
Yeah.
you're not exercising. Why hurry up and exercise? And it's the nagging, like drink
Yep.
your water, do this. And the
Yeah.
first thing I do is say, look, the $50 Alexa can remind you that nobody's yelling at the Alexa because they're an annoying nag, like just let technology remind them instead so that you guys can have a conversation about what show you're going to watch tonight or what's really interesting. And I love that you're talking to about like the parent-child dynamic because it's so true. I mean, I have totally been sitting in the living room when somebody's like child is calling and the person is saying to me, "Oh my god, they're calling again. They wanna know if I've taken my shower yet today, and if I'm gonna call them before, if I'm gonna call them after," like, that's not what you want, like, we are killing our relationships by having to have those conversations, but those
Yeah.
conversations come from love. But they
Yeah.
stem out of
True.
anxiety. They stem
Mhm.
from not having a plan, they stem from not knowing what's going on that side because they can't be in person. So I think
Yeah.
the more that people start to see that technology can help and they recognize like how impactful it can be, I think people will embrace it a lot more and they'll trust it a lot more to be able to, be the thing to be monitoring their families and making sure that they're healthy. So, well,
Absolutely.
this has been super fun. And I would just love to hear what your three top takeaways would be for clinicians. Like, if they want to guide their practice tomorrow, what could they take away from this conversation?
Yeah, so I think, the first is, and I say this, especially for experts, right? Like the clinicians you're talking about, even, you included, of, start having these conversations around technology with your patients for two reasons. One is to better understand what are their true pain points. I think a lot of
Mhm.
times we guess and we're like, I think they need help with this, but really it's maybe something much deeper or it's something much simpler. And then I would say, just, selfishly as an entrepreneur, building, technology is, try to be a part of conversations like this, right? You have
Yeah.
the patient's ear, and you're listening to everything they have to say. And, we can continue to innovate better and to create solutions that actually provide value if we hear that feedback, right? And
Right.
oftentimes we've got engineers sitting in silos building features nobody's ever going to use. And so we need you to be a part of that conversation. So I think that's number one. Number two, we talked about this many times, but it's really important to tailor solutions to each one of your patients. One solution is not going to be, it's not going to be a one size fits all. And there's so much technology out there, for better, for worse, and it's just such a saturated market. But I think, starting with that conversation and figuring out what are like the must haves in a product, I think it's a lot easier to weed through all of the noise.
Yeah.
And then, I think, the third thing is, trying to, and you actually talked about this with some of your patients, about exercising versus, needing grab bars down the road, is, really trying to take a more proactive approach versus reactive, right? And I think
Mhm.
data, the technology can all guide that discussion around, what are we seeing, right? Like, what are the trends in your activity levels, and what can we do to, I mean, and we've been talking about with Parkinson's, right? What can we do to slow down, whatever it is that's happening? And I think a lot of technology now is also transitioning to proactive versus reactive. I think healthcare is like that in so many
Yeah.
ways too, at least should be in every way. And so definitely with technology and how you're implementing it for your patients is, trying to look ahead, right? Not only what will my
Yeah.
patients need today, but what might they need 5 or 10 years down the line.
Yeah, I think definitely building out that plan of like, this is the small thing that we can do right now that's affordable. But if it doesn't work, then we need to progress to
Yeah,
something a little bit more expensive and something that maybe a little bit more permanent or long term. So is
absolutely.
that like buying a stove with that integrated or whatever? But hey, the cost is going to be significant.
Yeah.
So this has been amazing. How can people reach you if they want to learn more, if they have questions?
You can just reach out to me directly. I actually respond to every single customer email because I love learning and I love hearing from, just more broadly from people. So my email is akshita@omkitchen.com. My name is spelled Akshita. You can find us on our website, omkitchen.com. You can send us a support at omkitchen.com email, or you can find me on LinkedIn if you are on LinkedIn too.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, that's all the time that we have for today. Thanks again to Akshita Iyer for the insight and takeaways related to kitchen safety. And just before we go, a quick reminder, this episode is intended for educational purposes only and does not represent an endorsement of any specific company or product. We reference types of solutions, but these are to inform clinical decision making and not to promote specific brands. Thanks for tuning into this episode, and I hope to see you all again next time. Thanks for tuning in to Innovative Aging by MedBridge. Be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, your favorite podcast platform, or listen directly at medbridge.com. If you'd like to earn continuing education credit and access bonus resources from this episode, just log in to your MedBridge account and search for the show title to get started. And we'd love to hear from you. If there's a topic you want us to explore or a guest you'd love to hear from, reach out via Instagram or email us at podcasts@medbridge.com. Thank you for the work you do and for joining us as we explore what it truly means to age in place. See you next time.